Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from Antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Wednesday, March 1st, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. The U.S. tells other countries not to work with Assad on earthquake relief. So the State Department on Monday reaffirmed its opposition to countries upgrading their ties with the government of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, even if it is part of an effort to aid Syria's earthquake relief. So this is State Department spokesman Ned Price, and he said this in response to Egypt's foreign minister visiting Syria. He said, quote, "Our position on the Assad regime has not changed. Now is not the time for normalization. Now is not the time to upgrade relations with the Assad regime. We believe we can fulfill and that countries around the world can fulfill both of these imperatives, addressing the humanitarian needs of the Turkish people, addressing the humanitarian needs of the Syrian people without changing or upgrading their relationship with the Assad regime," end quote. So just saying there basically that they are against other countries coordinating, earthquake relief with Assad, which is just completely ridiculous. And right now, the death toll from the earthquake stands at 5,900 people in Syria. It hit northwest Syria, including the areas in the Idlib province that are under control of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is an al-Qaeda affiliated group that controls a lot of that territory. And it also hit government-controlled areas. And it killed over 44,000 people in Turkey. And, they're still cleaning up, and these numbers are expected to rise. So even with all this, the U.S. is still telling countries not to normalize with Assad, not to even work with him on this. And when the earthquake first hit, Price said that the U.S. would not work with Assad's government on the relief effort, saying that it would be counterproductive. And as it's become clear that the U.S.-backed regime change effort against Assad has failed in recent years, more countries in the region have been engaging with his government. And engagement with Assad has stepped up since the earthquake hit Syria. And when it comes to sanctions, I know I go over this a lot, but the U.S. has issued this 180-day exemption on its sanctions on Syria that are specifically designed to prevent the country's reconstruction. They have a devastating impact on civilians in the country, as sanctions always do. But these ones particularly because, again, they're designed to prevent the country from rebuilding after war. And this was all detailed by Elena Duhan, who is a UN Special Rapporteur on unilateral coercive measures. So anyway, the U.S. put a 180-day exemption on the sanctions that applies to transactions related to earthquake relief. But UN experts, including Duhan, are saying it's not enough. They should lift all the sanctions so they can, recover from this earthquake and then rebuild after. Because again, if the sanctions go back in place, they're designed to stop them from rebuilding. So that's going to apply to rebuilding from the earthquake as well as the war that first broke out in 2011. All right, the next one here, another one from our pal Ned Price at the State Department. The State Department refers a reporter to Israel when pressed on secret nuclear weapons program. So this is from Sam Husseini. We reprinted it from his Substack. He's been going into these State Department press briefings and has been asking all sorts of great questions. And one thing that he asked Ned Price a few weeks ago when he first went there was about Israel's secret nuclear weapons program. Israel has secret nukes. The U.S. does not acknowledge the program. Under a law, U.S. law, the U.S. is not supposed to provide military aid with nuclear proliferators. Israel would fall under that category because it has a nuclear weapons program, but the U.S. doesn't acknowledge it. So Sam's been asking the State Department about it, and I'm just going to read from this. On Monday, Ned Price would not acknowledge Israel's nuclear weapons arsenal, actually referring questions on the subject to the Israeli government itself. After the briefing, I received a written response to detailed questions regarding Israel's nuclear weapons that I submitted on February 13th. The State Department is, as I charged, maintaining, actually escalating a decades-long cover-up in not acknowledging Israel's nuclear weapons arsenal. This is for the apparent purpose of not invoking the Glenn-Symington Amendment to the Arms Exporter Act. So that's the law that says you can't send military aid to nuclear proliferators. So I'm just going to play the video here so you can hear the exchange. It's really something. Again, I mean, he refers him to the Israeli government for further questions.
Yes, final question.
Yeah, I asked you about the apparent Israeli violations of the Arms Export Act a week or two ago. And you said you weren't familiar with the laws that would cut off funding to any state that was a nuclear proliferator. Do you have anything further on that?
I believe the team provided you some additional background on that. As in the past, we're just not in a position to comment specifically on this. Would refer you and any questions you may have on this program.
How do you expect to have any credibility on this subject when you can't even acknowledge that Israel has a nuclear weapons arsenal?
Again, I just don't have anything to offer on this. We'd refer any questions to the Israeli government as a practice when it comes to just about any country, certainly any partner. We don't speak in detail to the capabilities, to the programs of partners around the world, just as we would expect they would not speak to ours.
You're referring me to the Israeli government about their own nuclear program.
That's correct.
About their own nuclear program. You can't acknowledge that Israel has a nuclear weapons program.
So, yeah, there you go. I mean, it's really something. And Sam quotes Grant Smith, who is the director of the Institute for Research, Middle Eastern Policy. And he, you know, this is something he really focuses on, specifically Israel's nuclear weapons program. So what he said, I'll just read this quote from Grant. He said, quote, "This is a major policy disclosure breakthrough. The State Department is admitting that formal U.S. acknowledgement of Israel's nuclear weapons program and accountability to U.S. taxpayers who want Arms Export Control Act compliance is Israel's decision." End quote. So again, he thinks this is a pretty big deal. And then Sam later, he puts in the written reply that he got from the State Department, and it's pretty much as Sam kind of summarizes it, is that they basically say, well, I'll just read what the State Department told him. They said, U.S. policy on this issue has been consistent for decades. The United States has long supported universal adherence to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons and remains firmly committed to the goal of a Middle East free of all weapons of mass destruction and delivery systems. We have urged all states that have not yet done so to accede to the NPT and to accept full-scope IAEA safeguards on all their nuclear activities. However, we acknowledge that achieving these goals in the Middle East is a long-term objective that will require essential precursors to be in place, including a comprehensive and durable regional peace and compliance by all regional states with their existing non-proliferation commitments and obligations. So the way Sam summarizes that is that Israel has to make peace with everyone before the U.S. will acknowledge it has nuclear weapons. That's definitely a long way away. So, yeah, I mean, I think this is a really big issue that doesn't get any attention, and especially the way the media generally covers Iran. You never hear about Israel's secret nuclear weapons program when they're talking about Iran's phantom nuclear weapons program that doesn't exist. And that's something I think that really opens up a lot of people's eyes once they realize, you know, the hypocrisy here and the real situation. So good for Sam, and it's great, you know, that we could reprint his stuff. All right, the next one here. The Afghan Inspector General warns that the U.S. is going to repeat mistakes in Ukraine. So the Inspector General for the Afghan war, whose job was to detail U.S. waste in Afghanistan and just how badly that mission went over there, the nation building specifically is what he focused on, the failed nation building experiment. He said that the U.S. is replicating its failed Afghan war policies in Ukraine. This is John Sobko. He's the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction. He warned that American-made weapons are probably falling into the wrong hands. I'll just read some quotes from him. He said, quote, "I'm not super optimistic that we are going to learn our lesson. I've been in Washington since 1982, and learning lessons is not in our DNA in the United States, unfortunately. There is an understandable desire amid a crisis to focus on getting money out the door and to worry about oversight later, but too often that creates more problems than it solves. Given the ongoing conflict and the unprecedented volume of weapons being transferred to Ukraine, the risk that some equipment ends up on the black market or in the wrong hands is likely unavoidable. We're spending a heck of a lot of money in that country, and anytime you spend that much money in any country, you're bound to get wastage. You're bound to get corrupt elements of not only the Ukrainian or the host government, but also of U.S. government contractors or other third-party contractors to try to steal the money. There's just so much money going in, and it's hard to keep track of," end quote. So, yeah, I thought that was really interesting. And then the next article here is also from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. Pentagon admits Russia captured American weapons in Ukraine. So the Pentagon told Congress about oversight when it comes to weapons and money going to Ukraine. Well, I guess weapons mostly. And they are claiming, there's no evidence that things are ending up on the black market, but they have admitted that some have been diverted by Russia. Russia is capturing things. They said that their assessment is that some of these systems have been diverted by Russia, and this was Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Colin Kahl. Again, he went on to say that there was no evidence that has surfaced to suggest Kiev was responsible for the weapons finding their way to the black market. I guess he's not saying that they haven't ended up on the black market. He's saying that there's no evidence that Ukraine is responsible for anything like that. And then in the early months of the war, Kyle just mentioned some reasons to believe, that things aren't going where they say they're going. CNN reported basically that once the aid weapons went into Ukraine, the U.S. had no way to track it. A source described it as dropping it into a big black hole. That same month, CBS News reported on U.S. aid to Ukraine, and they quoted this guy, Jonas Oman, a founder and CEO of Blue Yellow, which is a Lithuania-based organization that had been meeting with and supplying frontline units with aid. It told CBS News that all this stuff goes across the border and then only 30% of it reaches its final destination. That report from CBS was pulled immediately after the Ukrainian government came out against it. CBS said, "Oh, sorry, Ukrainian government." They pulled it. They said they were going to put up a fresh one, a corrected report, but I don't think they ever did. But we have that. Some people saved it. If anybody wants that, let me know and I'll send you the link. I would have to look for it, but we have the original documentary that somebody posted on, I forget where, Rumble or one of those YouTube alternatives. And then there was also, I forget, I think it was Finland's law enforcement, one of those countries in the region, saying that criminals in the region were ending up with weapons from Ukraine. And Nigeria's president said that terrorists in the Lake Chad region were ending up with weapons from Ukraine. All right, the next one here. NATO chief reaffirms the Ukraine will eventually join NATO. NATO Secretary Jens Stoltenberg reaffirmed on Tuesday that the alliance wants to eventually admit Ukraine, a promise first made in 2008 that was a major motive in Putin's decision to launch the war. Stoltenberg said this in Helsinki alongside Finnish Prime Minister Sanna Marin. He said, quote, "NATO allies have agreed that Ukraine will become a member of our alliance, but at the same time, that is a long-term perspective. What is the issue now is to ensure that Ukraine prevails as a sovereign, independent nation, and therefore we need to support Ukraine," end quote. So saying it's a long-term goal, but still saying it, they just keep dangling this in front of, both Ukraine and Russia. Zelensky has been repeatedly rebuffed. He's asked for fast track membership. He said, "Are we going to actually join?" And he's always told no. But Western officials still maintain that it's going to happen one day. And during the lead up to Russia's invasion, Russia was seeking security guarantees from the U.S. to de-escalate tensions. And one of their main demands was a guarantee that Ukraine would never join NATO. The Biden administration refused to make the promise, even though, according to reports at the time, the U.S. was telling Ukraine privately that it won't be joining NATO within the next decade. Zelensky said in March 2022, this was right after the invasion, that he was told privately there would be no NATO membership for Ukraine, but publicly the door would remain open. Again, just keeping this as a option, and it's something that they never discussed. They never seriously considered offering Russia any kind of writing guarantee that Ukraine would not join NATO. And I just threw in a quote from Biden. This is in June 2021. He was asked about Ukraine's NATO membership, and he said they must clean up corruption before joining NATO. And those concerns have obviously waned as the U.S. has shipped tens of billions of dollars in weapons and this direct budgetary aid to the Ukrainian government. And then when we're always talking about this topic, we have to mention the cable in 2008 that was written by William Burns, who's currently the CIA director. At the time, he was the U.S. I was going to say the Russian ambassador. He was the U.S. ambassador to Russia. And this was right before the Bucharest summit, when NATO promised that Ukraine and Georgia would eventually become members. And this is what William Burns told Condoleezza Rice at the time. He said, quote, "Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all red lines for the Russian elite, not just Putin. I have yet to find anyone who views Ukraine in NATO as anything other than a direct challenge to Russian interests," end quote. So they knew it was a provocation, yet they still... It's amazing how much that line that it was an unprovoked invasion is repeated. It's just unbelievable how they try to control the narrative like that. And that was released by WikiLeaks. That's how we know that, thanks to WikiLeaks. And Julian Assange is still, in prison, locked up in Belmarsh. While Ukraine is not expected to receive formal NATO membership anytime soon, Ukrainian officials consider themselves a de facto member, and NATO countries have big plans for a post-war Ukraine. They want to make sure they keep getting Western and NATO weapons. They want to build up Ukraine's military industrial complex. And these plans are likely unacceptable to Russia and could prolong the war. All right. The next one here, Zelensky says the situation in Bakhmut is getting more and more difficult. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky said in his nightly address on Monday that the situation around the eastern Ukrainian city of Bakhmut is getting more and more difficult as Russian forces continue to close in. So he said, quote, "The situation is getting more and more difficult. The enemy is constantly destroying everything that can be used to protect our positions, to gain a foothold and ensure defense," end quote. So if you're watching the video, I put a map in from South Front. They put out daily maps about the battlefield, and one specifically for Bakhmut. And Russia is coming close to encircling the city, and it looks like they just gained this territory on Monday. I think South Front is pretty accurate. I trust their stuff. So it looks like Russia's still continuing to make gains around the city. And they have been locked in battle over Bakhmut since August 2022 was when this battle started. So, that's a long time ago. But Russia started making gains in mid-January, and now they're slowly encircling the city. And Bakhmut is a small city, pre-war population of about 70,000. And Ukrainian forces have been taking very heavy casualties defending the city. And as I went over yesterday, a former American Marine fighting in Ukraine told ABC last week that the average lifespan of a Ukrainian soldier on the front lines in Bakhmut is only 4 hours, and called the area a meat grinder. Zelensky hinted last week that he was thinking about withdrawing from Bakhmut, basically saying that the city was worth defending, but not at any cost. Okay, let's see. Where are we here? There's a lot of stuff. I still have a lot to get through here. The next one, Russia blames Ukraine for drone attacks inside Russia. So Russian authorities on Tuesday reported a series of Ukrainian drone attacks across the country, including one that fell within 60 miles southeast of Moscow, which is hundreds of miles from the Ukrainian border. A Russian official said that the Ukrainian drone near Moscow attempted to target a gas facility, but it fell short of it. According to pictures of the wreckage, it was a Ukrainian-made drone that could fly up to 500 miles. Drone incidents were also reported in the Bryansk and Belgorod oblasts, which both border Ukraine. In Bryansk, authorities said one Ukrainian drone was shot down. In Belgorod, 3 drone attacks were reported, including one that flew through an apartment building. So there were no casualties in any of the incidents, but I think it could reflect that Ukraine is stepping up its attacks inside Russian territory. And Ukrainian officials don't officially take credit for these attacks inside Russia. They maintain a policy of ambiguity, but it's very clearly, Ukraine. And, they strongly hint that they're involved, and they might be getting some help from the US and NATO as well. Let's see. In December, Ukraine launched a series of drone attacks. So this was a few months back inside Russia. These were the first ones that were really deep inside Russian territory. And they targeted Russian air bases, including the Engels airfield, which is about 300 miles from the Ukrainian border. Then after that, NATO military sources told Asia Times that Ukraine, in these attacks, they employed drones that used satellite GPS data to hit their targets, U.S. satellite GPS data. So then also on Tuesday, while these Ukrainian drone attacks were reported, Russian President Vladimir Putin told the FSB security service to step up its efforts against sabotage groups that entered Russia from Ukraine. And he also claimed that Western intelligence services were involved in operations inside Russia. So Putin said, quote, Western intelligence services have traditionally always been active in Russia, and now they have thrown additional personnel, technical, and other resources at us. We need to respond accordingly, end quote. So this is the first time, and he might have said this and I missed it, but this is the first time I've noticed that Putin is accusing Western intelligence services of being involved in some of the sabotage attacks that have been taking place inside Russia. And it reminded me of, in December, Jack Murphy, who is an investigative journalist, former U.S. Special Operations Forces, he published a report on his website that I went over, and it alleged that the CIA has been using a European NATO country's intelligence services to conduct sabotage attacks inside Russia. He had trouble getting it published in the mainstream outlets, so he just put it on its website. And one thing, he said that they activated sleeper cells that were inside Russia. And then there's this other quote from Putin that kind of hints at that he thinks the U.S. and its allies might be involved in some of that activity. He said in his address to the FSB, Putin said that countering terrorist threats was a priority of the agency. And he said that there has been a growing number of such crimes, as he put it, terrorist attacks inside Russia. And he attributed the incidents to Ukraine, the Ukrainian government, but also, as he put it, quote, attempts by the West to revive extremist and terrorist cells formed by their so-called old-time friends on our territory, end quote. So again, it sounds like he's talking about sleeper cells there. And one thing Jack Murphy said in his report, explaining why he published it on his website and saying, people might criticize me for publishing this because it's exposing these covert operations. But he said, indeed, the Russian government knows perfectly well who is sponsoring these sabotage strikes. So he says the Russian government knows, and the only people that are unaware are the public. So I haven't seen any confirmation since that his report was published, but I thought it was interesting that Putin said that, and it's very concerning. And this next article here, I also referenced the Jack Murphy report. The Belarusian opposition claims attack on Russian plane near Minsk. Belarus's exiled opposition claimed on Sunday that partisans in Belarus, so this was a few days ago, they claimed this on Sunday. They claim that partisans in Belarus destroyed a Russian A-50 military surveillance aircraft in an airfield near Minsk. That's the capital in Belarus. This is Frank Vyakorka, and he is an advisor to Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya. I might have butchered her name there, but she is the leader of Belarus's opposition. So her advisor said, quote, partisans confirmed a successful operation to blow up a rare Russian plane at the airfield near Minsk, end quote. So I'm just going to call her Svetlana so I don't butcher her last name again. She is the leader of Belarus's opposition, exiled opposition, I should say. And she's received support from the U.S. since fleeing Belarus. She's based in Lithuania now. So in the 2020 presidential elections, saw Lukashenko, who has been Belarus's president for decades now, he won another term. The U.S. and the EU rejected the results, backed the exiled opposition and started sanctioning Belarus. And this pushed Lukashenko much closer to Putin. How I understand it I know some people that have family in Belarus, and they say they weren't really that close as everybody thought before this happened. So those sanctions, the U.S. pushing them together, could have really been how Russia was able to launch part of its invasion from Belarusian territory. So Vyakorka said on Twitter that the Russian aircraft was attacked with 2 drones and the perpetrators left the country. So he's claiming that the plane is unusable, but this hasn't been confirmed, and the Kremlin declined to comment on the incident. But Vyakorka claimed that this attack was the most successful since the beginning of 2022, and he's referring to reported attacks by Belarusian saboteurs on Russian supply lines inside Belarus that apparently took place during the first days of the war when Russia was launching the invasion from Belarus. And again, referring to Murphy's report, in that report, it actually says that the CIA was backing those sabotage attacks inside Belarus against the Russian supply lines. Again, a lot of this stuff is unverified, but I thought it was worth pointing out, again, since I saw Putin's comments. All right, the next one here. Democratic representative does not care that his Taiwan trip angered China. So this is Representative Jake Auchincloss. He's a Democrat from Massachusetts. I could be mispronouncing his name as well, but he was just in Taiwan as part of the bipartisan delegation led by Representative Ro Khanna. And he received a letter from China's embassy expressing that it was not happy that he went there. And I thought his response was interesting. This is in comments to the Daily Beast. He said he does not care if China is angry. He said, quote, "They're angry. I don't care. We're going to stand with freedom and democracy wherever it is in the world, in Ukraine, in Taiwan, and on the streets of Tehran," end quote. He said we can't just flinch because the Chinese are angry. So I just think that attitude shows that, Ro Khanna, who led this delegation, he did an interview with NPR while I think he was there saying, oh, it's not a provocation. I reaffirmed the one China policy. I told Chinese officials I was coming here, which is a good attitude to be more diplomatic. But China's clearly angry about it. They told Auchincloss in this letter that they were not happy, that they were very concerned, that made it clear they viewed it as a violation of the one China policy. And one of the days while they were still there, or it was either they were still there or they left, Taiwan did report an uptick in Chinese military flights around Taiwan. Pretty significant number of flights across that median line that China used to not cross that separates the two sides of the Taiwan Strait. So that could have been related. I don't know for sure if it was related to the congressional delegation, but I think it might have had something to do with it. And Khanna and Auchincloss, they're on this new committee on China, this House panel, this Republican-led House panel that was formed after the Republicans took over the House. All right, here. The next one, major anti-war protests held in Germany, France, and Italy. This is from Connor Freeman at the Libertarian Institute. There was a series of anti-war protests, also by Will Porter, this article, held across Europe. A series of anti-war protests over the weekend saw Western European citizens en masse demanding their governments pursue diplomacy with Russia and halt arms shipments to Kiev as the current conflict in Ukraine turned 1 year old. Major demonstrations, which saw people united across the political spectrum, were seen in Germany, France, and Italy. 10,000 people gathered in Paris to protest against France's membership in both NATO as well as the EU. Attendees also demanded an end to the French government's military aid to Kiev. Saturday, thousands participated in peace demonstrations in Italy. And then there is also the big ones in Berlin. So I think this is a good sign. And, of course, there was the rally in the United States in Washington, D.C., the Rage Against the War Machine rally that I was fortunate enough to attend. So there's going to be growing pressure like this, especially more so, I think, on the governments in Europe as they're dealing with the high energy prices. And, they're much closer to the conflict. So if something does turn hot with Russia, if it doesn't go nuclear right away, they're the ones that are going to be dealing with it. So I think that's a good sign. The next one here, the last one in the news section, the Defend the Guard Act passes the Montana House Committee. So this is from Bring Our Troops Home, which is a activist group that is involved in pushing this Defend the Guard legislation, which is at the state level. Dan McKnight, who runs the group, he's a veteran of the terror wars. He actually spoke at the Rage Against the War Machine rally and talked about this. This is something I kind of want to focus on more, because what this bill does, it prohibits the deployment of the state's National Guard into overseas combat missions without a declaration of war by Congress. So this is in Montana, and it was passed by the House, by a House committee. So the next step is that it's going to be voted on by Montana's House of Representatives. And I think we'll know by the end of the week if it's going to pass. But, I think this is a good way to approach things, is at the local level. And you could go to bringourtroopshome.us to find out more information. And you could find out, if people in your state are pushing this. There was a big hearing in Montana. Scott Horton actually spoke at it, and a ton of veterans. I mean, it's really something seeing all these stories from veterans, and, how, they don't want the National Guard or other troops to be deployed to these wars anymore. And I believe, I'm not sure about this, I'll double check it and maybe let you know later. Pretty sure the National Guard is in Syria right now, which is just so ridiculous that's who's being deployed to Syria, is the National Guard. They're always sent to these. Yeah, so this is August 2021. Sorry, I just did a quick Google search, and there was National Guard troops in Syria. And they're risking a lot being there. There's always these rocket attacks on U.S. bases there and all that. But that is it for the news. That was kind of a marathon. I hope I wasn't talking too fast there. There's just a ton of stuff. Go check out our Viewpoints, one from Jonathan Cook, How Social Networks Became a Subsidiary of the FBI and CIA. One from Ted Snyder, Public versus Private, Managing Perceptions of the War in Ukraine. One from JD Tusil over at Reason, Supreme Court says domestic spying is too secret to be challenged in court. One from Chris Hedges, Russiagate and Journalism's Death. And then our spotlight from Daniel L. Davis over at 1945, Don't Let Retired Generals Drag America into the Ukraine War. Whew, all right. That's it for me for today. You could always support us, antiwar.com/donate. Like and subscribe to the show. Share it around, all that. Share it on social media. But that's it. I'll be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.